Welcome to the Pioneer Podcast, brought to you by Lex Libertas. This is Ernst Roots. I'm speaking to you from Budapest in Hungary today. I'm here to attend the 5th Geopolitical Summit hosted by the Danube Institute of Hungary and the Heritage Foundation of the United States, an international conference under the banner Finding Order in a Time of Chaos, attended by people and representatives from all over the world, and I'm very privileged to have been invited by the Danube Institute to speak at this conference at two separate occasions at this conference to talk about what is happening in South Africa, some of the lessons that could be learned from South Africa, and also how people could help. But I don't want to go too much into the details of this particular conference in this podcast. As I'm recording this, I have already participated in a panel discussion, and I am still to participate or to speak at a session that was allocated particularly to discuss developments in South Africa. By the time this podcast is published, that discussion would have happened. I'm going to make a speech, an introductory speech, whereafter there will be a conversation. And so I'm going to give feedback about that later, due to the fact that this conference is still happening as I'm recording this. What I do want to talk about today is the state of the international conservative movement. I want to share 5 observations with you. Observations that I didn't read somewhere. It's observations from my own personal experience, from attending conferences like these, from speaking to people in various European states and also in the United States. 3 comments in particular, or observations about what is happening in the international conservative movement, if we might describe it as such, and then 2 observations about our position in this movement. When I say our position, I mean the position of Lex Libertas as an institution, but we can also make it a bit more broad and say the position of the Afrikaner people, or you could say the position of Westerners, Westerners from South Africa in this broader international conservative movement. But before we do that, I want to do a little housekeeping. I mentioned this in last week's episode that I have thus far tried not to encourage people too explicitly to subscribe to this channel, partly because I don't want to, but it is, however, necessary to do that. This channel is about 8 years old. It was started or opened back in 2016. When I was still with AfriForum, and there are many videos you could see from those times back then. And over a period of about 8 years, from 2016 to the beginning of 2025, this channel has grown from about 0 subscribers to more or less 25,000 subscribers. However, since the beginning of this year, up until now, September, over the last 9 months, this channel has grown with more than 300%. So it has grown from just about 25,000 to more than 75,000 subscribers. At the time of recording this, I believe we're at around 78,000 subscribers. And we have decided to push the subscribers because we need to pass the 100,000 mark, and there's a very important reason for that, not simply for the sake of broadening our reach, obviously that is important too, but because we want to shift the focus of this channel slightly, in the sense that we want to have many more conversations with significant people all over the world, significant role players in this international conservative movement that I'm going to describe in this video. And we have decided that we are going to implement this shift once we pass 100,000 subscribers. So the sooner we get there, the sooner we can do this. You would have noticed since the beginning of this year, we have started interviewing more people internationally. We have recorded some interviews in Budapest itself earlier this year. But we want to start doing this much more aggressively, you could say, by interviewing well-known podcasters, influencers, and so forth in the United States, in Washington, D.C., in New York, in Europe, in London, in Amsterdam, in Budapest. And we have the opportunity to do this partly due to the fact that I am regularly invited to speak at international conferences. And so it's not that difficult for us to do. But it's easier to get those big guests on a channel if we can show that the channel already has more than 100,000 subscribers. So please go and subscribe. Click the subscribe button right now. Alright, so as I mentioned, I want to use this video to talk about what is happening in the international conservative movement and some of my observations. And I want to share 3 broad ideas with you in particular. The first is that the international conservative movement is very vibrant and lively. About a decade ago, as recently as about a decade ago, the idea of being conservative was associated with being old school, and not in a good way. It was associated with being stuck in the past. It was associated with being against the idea of progress, of being backwards, and so forth. But that has changed quite quickly. Today, it's not cool to be liberal anymore. It's not cool to be a left-winger anymore. And it's very striking to see, firstly, the amount of dynamism among conservative think tanks all over the world, not just in Washington, D.C., think tanks here in Budapest, like the Danube Institute, the Center for Fundamental Rights, MCC, and so forth, but also other such think tanks all over Europe and in other places. It's lively, vibrant, there's a lot of energy, people talking about new ideas, and it's exciting, where it's very difficult to find the same type of enthusiasm among think tanks or organizations that could be described as on the left of the political spectrum. What you would find on the left is high levels of resentment, high levels of envy, high levels of aggression, high levels of blame shifting, and just a general bad vibe, which is partly the reason why you would find at these international conservative get-togethers or conferences, gatherings, and so forth, that it is very highly attended by young people, students, youth movements like Turning Point USA, and so forth, the Young Republican Club, and of course many such groups all over Europe and from other places in the world. You would find that young people are very much involved, but not just any young people, especially professional young people who look good, who dress properly, who are professional, who are successful in what they do, who are charismatic, who are strong leaders. And overall, these international gatherings have become an incredible place for networking, especially for young people, which is very good news. The second thing I want to discuss about the state of the international conservative movement is the balance between disagreement and consensus. And this is quite remarkable to see. There are some very important disagreements among people who participate in these conversations, who are actively involved. And oftentimes this comes to the fore. On a micro level, I could mention a panel discussion I was in here in Budapest during this conference I'm attending now, where the discussion was about whether globalism and international institutionalism is dead. And one speaker said, for example, that it is indeed dead, and it's basically just a matter of carrying out the body and replacing it with a return to our own institutions. To which another panelist responded by saying it's absolutely not dead. We must remember that at the United Nations, at this moment, they are not talking about retreating, they are talking about establishing world government and so forth. And so it was, on a small level, a disagreement, but there are also more serious disagreements. I think one of the most poignant topics today is, for example, the war in the Middle East, where there are some severe disagreements with people like Tucker Carlson on the one side of the debate, arguing very fiercely against United States intervention and so forth, and people like Ben Shapiro on the other side of the debate, arguing in favor of supporting Israel. And we find that there are very lively and often very heated debates. So there are some serious disagreements within what we might call the international conservative movement, but that does not mean that there isn't broad consensus. There is a broad consensus, despite these differences, that the notion of Western civilization is under threat, that the threat is somewhat from without. In other words, other groups, you might say other civilizations that are antagonistic towards the West, but also that it is largely from within, from Westerners, sections of Western civilization or Western society that have become so antagonistic towards the West and everything that the West stands for that it has become a destructive force. And we see this in wokeness and some of these other modern ideologies. There is a broad consensus that Western civilization is under attack. There is a broad consensus that it needs to be protected. And there is a broad consensus that it is good to find value in the past, to look in the past, in our tradition, for what we might describe as the true, the good, and the beautiful, and to work actively to preserve that. But not only is there broad agreement that we need to preserve what we have inherited from our ancestors for our descendants, there's also a broad agreement that every situation, every nation, every community is unique and that there are no one-size-fits-all solutions. That conservatism in America might look different and in fact should look different than conservatism in England, which of course would also be different from conservatism in Hungary and conservatism in a place like South Africa. Why? Because each of these sections of the globe or each of these unique societies have unique circumstances. And conservatism is not first and foremost about prescribing what is correct and what is incorrect, but it is about recognizing that yes, there are some universal truths, but also that different peoples live in unique circumstances and that they have developed their own traditions and cultures within that context, and that it is that needs to be protected. So this is diversity in the true and the good sense of the word, recognizing that there are differences and respecting that and cherishing that. The third point that I want to reference about the state of the international conservative movement is the extent to which a global network has been developed largely organically over the last few years and especially over the last decades. I have mentioned that different communities, different nations, different peoples have different circumstances, and as a result of which they think differently about problems and solutions. But what we have seen is that considering this and recognizing this and respecting this, we have seen over the last decade especially conservative groupings from all over the world reaching out just naturally through their natural work, through technology that have made this easier over time, reaching out to each other and supporting each other, even though there might be some differences of opinion in terms of the role of the state, for example, what the government ought to be doing, how we think about other civilizations and so forth. And it's incredible and really inspiring to see the extent to which there is broad agreement and cooperation in this regard. And this explains why we increasingly see conservatives being outspoken about matters in other countries. Conservatives from all over the world, for example, talking about the situation in Canada and the extent to which the Canadians are free, conservatives from all over the world talking about the situation in England, the extent to which the British or the English are free, the situation in Hungary, the situation in the Netherlands, and of course the situation in South Africa. And this is not because there is an attempt to apply a one-size-fits-all solution to every problem. It is, however, in recognition of the fact that Western civilization is under attack everywhere it manifests, and therefore that even though we might think differently about a lot of things, what we do agree on is that Western civilization is worth preserving and protecting. Preserving and protecting Western civilization does not imply conquering others or dominating others or having imperialistic tendencies, but it does imply preserving it where it is and supporting each other in this pursuit to preserve our civilization. Having said that, I want to make two remarks about our position in this context. I want to talk about what we might describe as our greatest strength, and then what we might describe as our greatest weakness. And once again, when I say our, I mean us as an institution at Lex Libertas, but I also mean it a bit broader, us as a community, the Afrikaner people in South Africa, but also Western nations or communities in South Africa, and broadly speaking, communities in South Africa that associate with the idea of conservatism as I have just described. So I would say our greatest strength at this stage is our unique experience, that there is a growing international consensus that South Africa is not behind the curve, but ahead of the curve, in the sense that South Africa is experiencing problems that the rest of the world is still to experience. That South Africa has gone much farther down the line in implementing what the Americans call DEI, what we in South Africa call BEE, Black Economic Empowerment, which of course has nothing to do with empowering black people. That South Africa has been implementing these policies for some time. That South Africa has certain demographic realities that the rest of the Western world is approaching. That a process of what has been dubbed South Africanization is happening in the Western world. And when we talk about South Africanization, we mean the process of other countries increasingly becoming like South Africa. And that is not good news. Yes, in the 90s, there was big international celebration about South Africa. South Africa was presented as an example for the world to follow, and the world indeed seems to be following the South African example, but not because the South African example is one that ought to be followed in the first place. And so we have a unique perspective where some of our friends from other countries talk about these problems in a way that is somewhat more theoretical, where our approach is much more based on our actual experience in living under a government that is very antagonistic towards anything that resembles Western civilization, where we live under a government that is currently implementing more than 140 discriminatory race laws, under a government that seeks to change the constitution to empower the state to confiscate private property without compensation, as they say, and where we as a nation and as a community have to find our own solutions within the context of our communities as opposed to getting support from the government. And so in this sense, we have something really unique to contribute to the conversation. And I believe this is part of the reason why there is this growing international interest in South Africa, in the Afrikaner people, and also in the fact that we remain optimistic under these circumstances because we believe that we have rediscovered an ancient truth, which goes back to the value of our communities and the importance of building community-based institutions. Using institutions as a vehicle or a vessel to promote the interests of the community, as opposed to using the state on the one hand, and as opposed to the notion that liberal individualism would lead to the outcomes that we desire. Or put differently, the notion that if we all just think of ourselves as individuals detached from our communities, we would find this outcome that we desire. The South African experience says no. The South African experience says that even when the government turns on you, you can still flourish as a community. You can still work towards a better future for your community. And that then brings me to what I regard as our greatest weakness in this context, which is linked in a certain sense to our strength, which is a result of the fact that we have gone farther down the road of deterioration. And one of the negative consequences of this is that we, from a South African perspective, have much less access to resources to do what ought to be done. After the tragic shooting of Charlie Kirk, a lot of people all over the world have been talking about Turning Point USA and the incredible work that this institution has been doing under the leadership of Charlie Kirk. But we ought to remember how Turning Point USA got started. It got started with a young Charlie Kirk, about 18 years old, having a plan and then reaching out to donors, to big corporations, to wealthy individuals, applying for grants and so forth, saying, I have an idea, I have a project, and we need to implement this, but we need funding to do this. What we find in many other countries in the world currently is that big conservative institutions are funded by their governments, that they get big grants from their governments, or if not funded by their governments, they are funded by very wealthy individuals who make significant contributions to these institutions to enable them to do their work. In the South African context, the idea of getting a grant from the government is outlandish and laughable. And in fact, we don't want money from the South African government because that would come with certain prescriptions. The idea of getting big donations from private individuals is also much more difficult in the South African context. And I would say that there are two reasons for this. One reason is that South African companies are struggling. It's difficult to make profit. Yes, there are some very wealthy companies and individuals in South Africa, but overall, for the majority of companies, it's not as if there's that much money lying around that could just be distributed to NGOs. That is one part of the reason, and the other part of the reason, I would say, is the fact that the political climate in South Africa is quite polarized, and funding such institutions as a company would be regarded as very politically incorrect and might have some form of a ramification in terms of a backlash from the government. However, in this weakness, we have also discovered a strength, a very significant strength, and that is the strength that lies in what you might call crowdfunding, getting large numbers of people to make small donations on a regular basis. And it is through that that we can drive these institutions that we have in South Africa. I would say, however, that even though this is a significant strength, we need to work on getting big corporations on board to become actively involved with working towards solutions, or at least contributing to those that are working towards solutions. Just this day, I had a conversation with someone from the United States here in Budapest, and the person asked me, when are we going to host a big international conference like the one that I'm attending right now in South Africa? And the answer is, we would love to host a conference like that. In fact, many people have advised us to do that because it would strengthen our international position significantly. It would also strengthen international interest in South Africa and in the state of South Africa, and also in our pursuit of decentralizing South Africa significantly. But a conference like this is very expensive. It typically implies paying for speakers, paying for their flight tickets, paying for their accommodation, and then, of course, the venue, the food, and everything that goes with that. If our primary source of funding is individuals making small monthly donations, it's hard to conceive that we would be hosting such conferences in South Africa, because we have to ensure that every rand in the South African context that we get is spent as wisely as possible. But if we were to get big corporations to become involved, I can foresee and conceive that we can start hosting big international conferences with speakers from all over the world flying into South Africa talking about what's going on in their own countries, but especially then talking about what's happening in South Africa, understanding what is happening in South Africa, what is being done about the crisis, and what could be done to support those. I would not say that this is outside of the realm of possibilities. I do think that it is still possible for us to do that, but we need to take things one step at a time. And for now, we are very grateful to have received the invitations that we have received just since the beginning of this year to speak at events like these all over the world about what's happening in South Africa, the growing international interest, the growing international support. And from where we are, we certainly can only go upwards as far as that is concerned.